After all, what's the point of a sermon about finding silence if we aren't going to try to experience it, at least a tiny bit, right? All right. Who here has seen the movie Trolls? Or Trolls 2? Yeah. Okay. Only people with very young kids at home, I'm guessing. I've seen it a lot of times now. It's a few years old now. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's an animated feature about a group of tiny, doll-sized trolls that are characterized mostly by their love of sing and dance and hugging. And there's also a group called the Bergens, which are much, much larger and who are never happy except when they eat a troll. There, that's the whole premise of the movie, pretty much. I just ruined the first, 2 minutes of it, but that's okay. It's a kid's movie. My youngest, it's still one of his favorites. He quotes it incessantly, actually. So I won't ruin the whole plot. But there's a moment where two of the trolls are out in this forest in which they live, and one of them keeps singing and talking and making noise. Again, if you have been around children, you will be familiar with this phenomenon. As the other is trying to go to sleep. And this includes singing with full orchestral accompaniment, the Simon and Garfunkel tune, The Sound of Silence, which I think is a particularly funny moment in the movie. A very non-silent song about the sound of something that, by definition, doesn't have any sound, right? Which is how I'm introducing a sermon about trying to preach about the virtues of silence, right? There's kind of a hypocrisy there or something there, right? So here we go, nevertheless. I have never taken an intentional time of silence, anything like John Francis did. I don't think I've made it more than maybe 2 days. I can't imagine taking years or even weeks, honestly, of silence like he did. Good for him. That's not a criticism. It's just not for me. Maybe it's not for you. Maybe it is for you. In fact, I was really thinking about this as I read his reflection. I think the longest I've been silent is probably a weekend worth back in my bachelor days, and it wasn't super intentional. I just happened to stay home the whole weekend and not have to talk to anyone. I do not remember getting any enlightenment from that weekend. In fact, the thing I do remember about it is not feeling very good at the end of it. I wasn't lonely. I think it was more that I also hadn't done much physical activity for 48 hours, frankly. My body was not happy about that part of it, not so much the being silent. But silence. My life today, probably like many of you, is far from silent. I rarely go more than an hour or two without speaking. The drive up here, frankly, might be the longest time I get to not speak to someone. But I'll confess, even if I'm not the one talking, I don't really like silence very much. When I'm home alone, I often have the TV or music or something on because I think it's strange when it sounds too quiet. Even just when the weather's decent, the window's open so that I can hear the sounds from outside. Because the real truth is that the noise and chaos and the utter lack of silence, it's not just everything around me, that's in my head too, right? I'm sure all of us are different, but I have trouble finding anything remotely like silence or even calm in my head. There's always thoughts going on, bouncing around. Some of you may be familiar with this. But whether that's what's in your head or it's the outside getting you, there's so rarely silence in our world, or anything even approaching it. Maybe you can find a spot where you can close your eyes and still your breath for a moment, but still you'll hear sounds, rustling or wind or air condition blowing, the various mechanical hums from the machines that surround us. Many of them make our lives easier, but they also have a constant clutter of noise and lights and stuff just going on all the time. And what this brings me to is that we all need spiritual practice in our lives. I realize that's kind of an abrupt shift. Stay with me for a second. What is a spiritual practice? Anything that is a repeated, intentional activity that helps ground you and deepen your spiritual life. And spiritual practice helps. I've tried over the years a lot of forms of meditation and prayer, and the truth is that most of them didn't do much for me. I imagine there's a countless number of spiritual practices that won't work for any given person. But I'm also equally convinced that there is at least one spiritual practice that will work for each person. Not all spiritual practice involves silence. A lot of them do not, in fact. Many spiritual practices are quite loud and energetic. You might think of singing or ecstatic dancing or exercise or drumming or a dozen others we could name. But the one thing that does characterize all spiritual practices and that they foster is a sense of focus, a sense of grounding and finding one's center. Another way to say that might be what I often say before prayers here in worship. Try to still your busy mind, right? Spiritual practice can help with that. My wife, who many of you have met, is also a Unitarian Universalist minister, but the real passion in her life is baking. It is very much a spiritual practice for her. Now, personally, I find baking very frustrating, particularly the things about it, the measuring, the exactness that steps involve. You have to knead enough, but not too much. You're supposed to fold in the whipped egg whites, not stir, which is a difference that I think I understand, but maybe. But I know for her and for many others, it's a soothing, calming, focusing practice. So spiritual practice, though, is often done by oneself, but paradoxically is ultimately about connection, about calming and focus, connecting with the universe. I was thinking recently of something I learned about in seminary, which is not exactly the same as silence or speaking out, but it's related. So there was this idea, and still is for that matter, and it's really not one idea, but multiple ideas I'm going to kind of group together, that dates back thousands of years, and it's a way to approach theology. There's a school that came to be called apophatic theology, it's a Greek word, which proposes that the only legitimate way to talk about ultimate reality, or we might say God, or what you will, the only way to legitimately talk about that is through negation. That is, that some things are so unknowable that all we can do is say some things that we know are not true about them. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. Apophatic theology's counterpart is cataphatic theology. The idea that you can say true but necessarily incomplete things about God or ultimate reality. The classic example of this is to say that God is love. That's not all God is. That doesn't explain all of God's godness, but it's a true thing we could say. Cataphatic theology attempts to state what a thing is. Apophatic theology says that it's presumptuous when talking about things beyond our understanding to think that you can do that, and you should instead talk about what they aren't. I have a really great quote about this that uses both of them, actually. This is from Martin Luther King Jr. He was saying, "True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice." So he does both of them there, right? Apophatic, it's not merely the absence of tension, it's the presence of justice. Cataphatic theology. And there's a somewhat similar line of thinking in science. It's, of course, as the scientists here in the crowd will know, you can really only prove that something is not true. You can't prove that it is true. I'm oversimplifying there, I know, but stay with me. So hypotheses in scientific experiments are usually phrased negatively so that you can prove the hypothesis. Many, perhaps all theories are in some sense things that we have not yet proved to be false and that we therefore think are probably true. When we talk about silence in our world, perhaps this can give us a sense of what we really mean. Not some sort of Platonic ideal of silence, but a quiet that allows us to at least know what real silence might be like. It might be that a letting go of words and noise in our life, like John Francis spoke about, helps us appreciate their absence, lets us really focus on what there is out there. Now, in this time in our world, I think of what silence can mean in the context of our social justice work. Often in social justice work, silence is equated with complicity, with remaining silent in the face of injustice, which is a mistake we cannot afford to make. But there's a different kind of silence, or a different use of silence, perhaps, that is an important part of any justice work. And that's what Francis spoke about too, the quietness of listening, of allowing for others to speak, of letting real discernment happen. All people of privilege, and everyone experiences some sort of privilege at some time. Certainly all of us here in the room live in the United States. We, generally speaking, have access to education and sanitation. Some of us have privilege due to skin color or gender or other identities, something that I think about very strongly in this Pride Month. Some of us have the privilege of class. We could talk about a dozen others. When you have more privilege than others that you are with, it's a good time to practice silence. Curious, engaged silence. Because being an ally sometimes means closing your mouth. Listening without planning an immediate reply is something that Francis lifted up in our reading today too. It means learning. It means exploring the virtues of silence and letting voices that often have been silenced come to the front. It means acknowledging that for all our privileges, there are things we will never experience that others can teach us about. And we, all of us, need to hear this message. And just a word about Unitarian Universalists. We are a wordy people. We love sermons, we love books, we love finely crafted arguments and lectures and discussions. We love conversation. We often, in fact, let me speak in an I statement. I often feel uncomfortable with silence. I told you earlier about how I have to have background noise on when I'm alone at home. I think, and this applies to me as much as anyone, that Unitarian Universalists need to become more at home with silence, more at home with things like ritual that don't depend on words, more at home with mystery, and less reliant ultimately on the almighty word. Because facts and words and arguments by themselves are not going to save us. We have to learn to embrace silence. We have to seek and discern the wisdom it takes to know when we should speak up and when we need to stay silent. The time when we have to jump in and when it's time to hold back and listen. Ultimately, this is the beginning of wisdom. It is the fruit of spiritual practice, done in community with the support of people who love us, who care for us, who are holding us accountable to be our best selves. Today, I wish you all the wisdom, all the fruits, all the benefits of silence. May it be so.